Lewis is a reader at the School of Psychology at the University of Cardiff. By now, you know that I asked Lewis how he knows Ira, and I asked Ira how he knows Lewis. It turns out that Lewis was Ira's first postdoctoral researcher, the first postdoctoral researcher to join Ira's group in Lyon. Lewis did his PhD before that at the University of Warwick on concepts and categorization. I asked Lewis why ever did he decide to leave the English Midlands to go to the south of France. Predictably, cheese, wine, and croissants were mentioned in the response, but I quote Lewis, pragmatics turned out to be pretty good too. So Lewis brought his expertise in concepts and categorization tasks to Ira's groups, and together they published their 2004 paper in JML, which is considered by many to be an impeccably designed study documenting that the generation of scalar implicatures requires time. They then followed up on this work with further papers. Lewis further explored these ideas in other collaborations with Jack Tomlinson, for example, and others, and introduced mouse tracking to our experimental pragmatic community. And more recently, in collaboration with Emmanuel Schemla, with Alice Rees and others, Lewis introduced another very, very influential way of studying implicature, which is priming, and which is also becoming very, very popular. So with huge thanks to Lewis for his contribution to the XPrag enterprise, we now have the chance to hear him reflect about what priming can tell us about implicatures.
Okay, thanks very much there, Napoleon. So I'm just going to try sharing now. And let's see. Can you see my slides?
Everything is fine. Go ahead.
Okay, just waiting for this to go to full screen for me. Okay, that's great. So the first thing I'd like to say is obviously thank you very much to Ira. I think me more than almost anybody else, I've got so much to thank him for, really. The first thing is actually taking me on. So as somebody who knew nothing about language, certainly nothing about pragmatics, didn't speak French, to be employed by Ira at Lyon was quite a thrill for me. So I can only assume that the pool of candidates must have been a little bit smaller than he expects nowadays. But I was very, very pleased to go. The second thing I'd also say is that I thank him so much for giving me that Bott and Novak paper. When I look back on it, without that paper, I wouldn't have got any of the jobs I've got since, and it also just introduced me to a wonderful area. I was also trying to think about why I liked that paper so much, and I think it was the way Ira gave me theoretical linguistics and combined it with psychology, and that's really, really hard to do. And I think Ira's done that a number of times now. It's not just coincidence. Perhaps as Napoleon and others have said, that's the essence of experimental pragmatics. So overall, thanks very much. So I'm going to move on now to the talk, what structural priming is going to tell us about implicatures. When I talk about priming, I'm talking about the interpretation of a sentence being influenced by preceding material. And, I've been very much influenced by Catherine Bott and Pickering and Brannigan and the idea of structural representations in that work. And that led me in a manual to design studies to investigate priming in implicatures. And what we found basically is that you can influence whether a participant derives an implicature from a given sentence by varying the prime. And I'm going to talk about kind of why this is useful, I think, for experimental pragmatics. First of all, I'm just going to describe the basic priming phenomenon. And then I'm going to take you through two new studies. One, I think this is my first ever developmental paper on priming. And the second one is on lexical influences on implicatures. So I'm going to start with the basic phenomenon then, taken from the paper with Emmanuel Chemler. And what we did was a sentence picture verification task. You've got two pictures, one sentence, and you have to click on the picture that best matches the sentence. And it's a very simple task. So it turns out I can't read the top of my slide here, which so I have to remember what it says, but I think it says all of the symbols are spades. And you just click on the picture that best matches the sentence there as a participant, and you know that the left-hand picture is the one you pick, and that's fine. We also gave people these better picture trials, if you like, to introduce more ambiguity into the task. The title here, I think, is there are 6 squares. That's the sentence. And you again have to click on the picture that best matches the sentence. And participants are told that when they see this better picture, they're supposed to select that better picture when they can think of an image that better matches the sentence. So those are the 2 basic trials there. And what we did then within that task is to introduce primes and targets. So there are different linguistic expressions. We had quantifiers, ad hoc, and number expressions. I'm not going to talk about the number expressions. I'll just focus on the quantifiers and the ad hocs. There were 2 interpretations to the experimental sentences. Strong, that means with the implicature, or weak without the implicature. And we have prime trials and target trials. Prime trials obliged or kind of forced the strong or the weak implicature. They forced you to interpret the sentence in one way or another. And immediately after that, you saw target trials in which both of the interpretations were allowed, the strong or the weak interpretation. And in common with other priming papers, we found that the target interpretation reflects the prime. So I'll just go through some of the primes and some of the targets to illustrate the paradigm a bit more. So here we've got a quantifier quantifier weak prime. Some of the symbols are spades, and you in this case, it's a weak prime. So what you do, you select the one on the right hand side there, and then you'll get a target. Some of the symbols are diamonds, and perhaps because you've just had that prime sentence saying, encouraging the weak interpretation, you're going to be happy sticking with the left-hand image there. So that's the one you're going to go for, the weak target. Then here we've got a strong quantifier prime. Some of the symbols are stars. Okay, well, both of them seem to have stars on them, but the some but not all interpretation seems to be more relevant here. So you pick the one on the left. And then you maybe get another target trial. Some of the symbols are diamonds. And here you might be thinking more of an implicature. You're thinking some but not all of the symbols are diamonds. There should be a different picture there. So you maybe go for your better picture option. We also had ad hoc trials. So we've got a weak prime here. There is a diamond. Well, here there's a diamond on the right-hand card. It doesn't matter, there's something else there. Yeah, I'm going to go for that right-hand card. And then you've got the strong ad hoc prime. There's a heart. Well, there's a heart in both of them. But the speaker didn't say that there's a heart on a star, so you're licensed to infer it's just the heart. And then you've got the ad hoc target. There's a star, and perhaps because you had a strong ad hoc prime beforehand, you think, well, there is a star means that there's a star and nothing else. So perhaps you'll select the better picture card here. So that's your basic priming paradigm, and you end up with results something like this. So these are the responses to the targets here, and along the y-axis we've got the proportion of strong responses, the proportion of implicature responses. Along the x-axis you've got the prime type, whether it's a strong prime or a weak prime. And then in the different categories, we've got the linguistic expression. So we've got some and ad hoc there on the top. And what you can see is that when the prime is a strong prime, you're getting a much higher rate of strong target interpretations than when the prime is weak. And that applies for both the some items and the ad hoc items. Okay, there's more strong interpretation than some case, than the ad hoc case, but the basic pattern is still there, you know, the difference between the strong and the weak interpretations. So on to kind of now, you know, why this might be useful, this kind of idea, and what it can tell us. And so I'm going to talk you through this developmental priming study that I've kind of relatively recently done with Alice Rees. And you know, we're trying to answer the basic, the old question about why children show lower rates of implicature than adults. And this priming study is addressing the lexical alternatives hypothesis, which luckily Jesse has explained to us in great detail, so I don't need to explain it very much here. But basically the idea is that children understand all and some at a semantic level very well, but what they can't do is link the two up. So they can't really identify that all is an alternative to some. And there's a variety of evidence that Jesse talked about. You know, basically that children accept only some in under-informative cases, unlike adults, but not only in the ad hoc cases. And that's, you know, really pretty weird for adults to do when you look at it. It's kind of, you know, really infelicitous to have only some in the under-informative cases. And, you know, other evidence is that they can derive ad hoc implicatures apparently with ease, as kind of recent work has shown, using exactly the same materials as quantifiers, but they seem to unable to derive the quantifiers. So how are we going to test them? Well, test this. Well, we're going to do priming tasks with children. We've got ad hoc expressions, quantifying expressions, and we've got the strong and the weak primes, the types of things I've shown you when I was describing the basic phenomenon. But we've also got alternative primes. So these alternative primes, they appear just before the targets, just like the strong and weak primes. And their idea is to make the alternative salient. So you're trying to boost the saliency of the alternative. And when you do this task with adults, what you find is that after the alternative, responses to the targets are basically the same as after the strong prime. So there's a large difference between the alternative and the weak prime, and a large difference between the strong and the weak prime. And then, of course, we've got the ambiguous targets as well. So I'll come back to the actual hypothesis in a second. I'll just show you some of the materials we used here. And we try to be, you know, as close to David Barner's study as we could in many ways. So I've got the quantifiers up here. So we've got the strong prime. Some of the animals are dogs. You know, and you've got kind of a partial set on the left-hand side. We've got the weak prime. Some of the animals are cats. The children have to select the one that's consistent with all. And then you've got the alternative there. All of the animals are sharks. And then you've got the target. Some of the animals are pigs. So you've got the kind of weak interpretation on the left there, and the better picture, as usual, corresponds to the implicatory interpretation. Here are the ad hoc items. So we've got the strong prime, you know, the same as the basic phenomenon I showed you. There's a fox. There's a fox in both of them, but in one of them, you're licensed to make the inference that It's only the fox, so that's the one you select. The weak prime, there's a chicken, and there's a card with a chicken and something else. And then you've got the alternative, which is the conjunctive in this case. There's a bat and a caterpillar. And then for the target, there's an octopus. So you've got the kind of weak target on the left and the strong interpretation on the right, the better picture. So let's have a look at the lexical alternatives prediction then. Well, given what Barner et al. And others have found, you might basically expect adult-like priming of the adult ad hoc trials. And what that means is the alternative prime is going to lead to strong target responses. The alternative prime is making the alternative salient, and so boosting the rate of implicatures relative to a case where you have a weak prime. Now, for quantifiers, what that lexical alternatives account is saying is that you don't have this link between all and some. Now, if you can't link these in your lexicon, then there's no reason to expect priming to happen. So in other words, that alternative prime is not going to prime a greater number of strong target responses. Expressed in other ways, the alternative prime, the alternative priming should be lower in quantifiers than in the ad hoc cases. So you get an interaction of expression by prime. Now, in some ways, the earlier work by Nausicaa and by Skoros and Papafrago is demonstrating that children can be primed with the alternative to derive implicatures. I think what the lexical alternatives account would predict is, or how they would explain that, is to some extent that you would just expect more priming in the ad hoc case than in the quantifiers. So you expect, some level of alternative priming, but you might expect more for the ad hocs than you would for the quantifiers. So just quickly summarizing the method here, we've got 72 children, aged between 4 and a bit and almost 6. We've got 50 adult controls, 2 sorts of expressions, quantifiers and the ad hocs. We've got primes, the strong, the weak, and the alternative. And we've got 4 of each prime target combination. So basically, 48 experimental trials. So here are the results of the primes here. So the primes are completely unambiguous, for adults at least. And we've got the proportion correct responses as the y-axis, and we've got the prime as the x-axis there. And it's a rather uninteresting graph in many ways for the ad hocs. Then what you see is ceiling performance 100% on those prime trials. So basically, they can do those ad hocs well. For the weak quantifier primes and for the alternative quantifier primes, they're again at ceiling. But when it comes to the strong prime, the picture I've got there, your classic scalar implicature choice, then children are far lower than ceiling. They are above chance, but they're much, much lower than the other conditions, and that is exactly what you'd expect here. So what we're trying to investigate is why children are not doing so well on the implicatures, and in that case that we can't expect them to do well on the quantified primes. But on the other hand, it's actually comforting to replicate the effect in what is quite I suppose a different paradigm and one that's only been used on adults before. Okay, so now we come to the target trials. So what I've got here is the ad hoc trials, and what you can see is a relatively high rate of strong responses of implicatory interpretations, and the alternative and the strong primes are leading to a greater rate of strong responses in the targets than the weak prime. just as what happens in the adults. The more interesting case, of course, is the quantifiers. And what we're seeing here is basically the same pattern in the ad hoc trials as in the quantified trials. Certainly, the interaction of expression by prime type suggests there's no differences there at all. You can also look at the individual comparisons. Here you see a slight difference. So what you do see is there's a large or strong priming effect between the alternative and the weak trials. Now that's exactly the crucial comparison, because the question is whether children can link up the alternative with the scalar expression, and there's clearly a large priming effect there. And what we don't get is a priming effect between the strong and the weak trials, but that is entirely to be expected, because they can't do the primes. So there's no reason to expect them to be able to get to show a priming effect between the strong and the weak interpretation. So to summarize then, what we're getting is strong ad hoc alternative priming effects. So the ad hoc alternative prime leads to strong target responses. We're getting the same kind of effect in the sum trials. So the sum alternative prime leads to a high rate of strong target responses, again relative to the weak prime. And we're getting no difference between them, no statistical difference between them, which is, in my mind, arguments against the simplest lexical alternatives hypothesis. They're showing a link between the alternative and the scalar expression at the same time as they're actually failing to do the implicatures. I think one question you can ask here, perhaps, is it the alternative prime increasing the strong responses, or is it the weak prime that's suppressing them? I mean, in the case of children, I think that you've got to say that the likely story is that it's the alternative prime increasing the strong responses, because after all, the children are defaulting to the weak interpretation. That's what we're actually trying to explain. If the children are defaulting to the weak interpretation, then it seems unlikely that the weak prime can then kind of lower that interpretation. There's also a question there about kind of what the weak prime could do to suppress the alternative that would mean that there isn't a connection between the alternative and the scalar expression. So I think kind of, first of all, the default has to be that the children are going for the weak interpretation and that the alternative prime increases them. But if not, you've got to explain how the weak prime could suppress that interpretation without invoking some kind of link with the alternative. However, to be absolutely honest, as Alice pointed out to me when we were writing this, we haven't really got a better idea about why children are more logical than adults than the lexical alternative hypothesis, unlike Jesse, who had a much better explanation. I have to say this is slightly negative, but I don't think the answer is in this lexical alternatives account. So to me, in a way, the fact that we could prime children with the scalar, with the quantifiers and the ad hocs, wasn't so much of a surprise. But what I did find very surprising was the extent of the strong responses for the ad hoc trials in the children. So, if you compare the children and the adult responses here, then for quantifiers, first of all, you can see that the adults have a kind of overall a higher rate of implicatures than the children. But when you look at the ad hoc trials, the pattern completely reverses. So you're getting a very high rate of ad hoc responses and a very low rate of ad hoc implicatures in adults. So, and that effect is absolutely huge. You know, that there's 2 or 3 times the rate of implicatures in the children than in the adults. Now, basically what seems to be happening here is that the children are becoming more pragmatic than the adults are being more pragmatic than the adults on those ad hoc implicatures. When you look back at the literature about this, I agree with Jesse. It's not, I mean, there is some inconsistency there. I mean, I think when I look at it, a lot of studies have ceiling effects when you're trying to compare adults with children on this task. Horowitz and Stiller, they both have adults and children at ceiling, so you can't actually compare the two. There's only one study I found that showed that didn't have a ceiling effect, in fact, and that was Nicole Gottman's study, and she found that kind of adults getting about 5% implicatures and children about 14%, which is consistent with this study, but they didn't make anything of that result, and they didn't. I don't think they even analysed it, and also the difference is perhaps a lot smaller than in this study. So we're getting this kind of massive rate of ad hoc implicatures in the children compared to the adults. So the children, somehow are learning this other interpretation. I mean, the one caveat I'd make to this is, while, I know the adult rates are completely stable, that's exactly the pattern of proportions I see in, all of these studies, and you're going to get the same thing if you do it. With children, it's only one study, so, I just really don't know. And you obviously can't experimentally assign people to be children or adults, and so, it could be all kinds of other factors influencing the children's responses there. But I was struck just by the size of the difference between those response rates. The next experiment I'm going to talk about is the impact of the lexicon on scalar implicatures. So going back to these studies on structural priming, a lot of the point of them really is to establish whether there are abstract or non-lexically based representations, either semantic or syntactic representations. And it's crossed my mind that we haven't really addressed this question in experimental pragmatics yet. So there's very little or even no empirical evidence that implicatures use abstract representations, even though in many ways when we talk about them, the underlying assumption is that they are completely abstract. And to investigate this question, we conducted a couple of experiments looking at priming across languages. And the study I'll show you here is priming between Welsh and English. And in these studies, we presented the prime in one language, prime in Welsh, the target in English, and all combinations thereof. So English to English, Welsh to Welsh, Welsh to English, English to Welsh. And we looked at the cross-language priming and the within-language priming. So across-language priming gives you a measure of whether there are abstract implicature structures there. And the reason for this is simply is the lexical and the lexical information is different across these two languages, as I'll show you in a minute. We also compared the within language priming against the across language priming, and because more within priming than across priming suggests at least some lexical influence of on the implicatures. So I've got some examples here. They're very similar to what you've seen before. This is a Welsh strong example. Clicha yw rhai o siapiau, meaning that bells are some of the shapes. That's a kind of Welsh strong prime. And then you might get an English target. Some of the symbols are hearts. Just to tell you, a little bit about the Welsh here. So One of the reasons we used Welsh is because the word order can be different in Welsh than in English. So you can put the object first in Welsh, and it's absolutely fine. So llyfrau, yw rhai o siapiau, llyfrau books are some of the shapes, as opposed to English, some of the symbols are books. So you can have different word orders, certainly for sum and number in Welsh. And also it's quite possible to have no cognates across the languages. So the Welsh for all is bob, and the English for all is some. And we've got rhai, meaning, yeah, I can't remember what I said now. Bob means all and rhai means some. I can't remember what I said before. But, you know, and you can choose the vocabulary, so you can make sure there's no overlap between them. And I think, you know, the reason to do that is to minimize the possibility of direct translation. Although, you know, these are bilingual people, and so there's absolutely no reason for them to actually directly translate the stimuli. So just a quick summary of the methods: 114 fluent Welsh English bilinguals. We had the 4 language prime target pairs: Welsh English, English Welsh, Welsh Welsh, English English. 3 enrichment types: sum, numbers, and ad hoc. 2 prime types: strong and weak, making 96 experiment trials, 48 fillers, 16 of each enrichment. So here are the results for the within language conditions. We've got proportion of strong responses over there on the y-axis, and these are, you know, very similar to the adults responses I showed you in the children's study. So yeah, I think you probably do have the labels. I can't see them. So these are the ad hocs down here. And very low rate of strong responses. And then we've got sum and numbers over here, but in all cases, you can see a large priming effect. So the strong prime is in green, the weak prime is in this kind of orangey browny color. And when there's a strong prime, there's a much higher rate of strong responses than the weak prime. So that's the within language. And now I'll show you the across language. What you can see, the A stands for across languages, W within. Yeah, what I should have said is that I've combined these to make within language and across language independent of the actual language. So these are the across languages are Welsh to English combined with English to Welsh. And within is Welsh combined with English to English. And yeah, what you can see from the across language effects here is that they're just as big as the within language effects. There's no difference between them. You get huge priming effects across languages, and you get huge priming effects within languages, and there's no difference. So, as I said, we get large priming effects within and across languages. Base factors around 0.006, you know, thoroughly respectable. So that means we're getting strong evidence of abstract or non-lexical priming, and also no evidence of any lexical impact on this either. So the question then is, you know, what is being primed here? Now I think that the most obvious answer is that there's some kind of structure, some kind of pragmatic structure that's being primed across these languages. Just as with the syntactic and semantic priming literature, you get syntactic structures primed across languages as well. The problem is trying to identify what that pragmatic structure might be. Now, the one that I've thought about is the negate and combine or what I think we called it in recent Bott, the usage mechanism, some kind of structure that combines sentence plus not alternative, your definition of an implicature, basically. But the thing is, in recent Bott, we really tried hard to find that and to prime it, and we didn't. Now, Paul Marty and Richard and various others, I think, did find some evidence of priming of that structure, although it's a proceeding, so I'm not entirely sure. But from the presentation, there were quite small effects. Now, if you look back in Bott and Chandler, you could argue that, for those of you who know that paper, that the across expression priming would be evidence of the negate and combine structure. But those effects are also very tiny. They're kind of Cohen's d of 0.15. And so all of those papers, if they found anything, were finding very small effects of priming that structure. Whereas here, what we're getting is effects of 0.5, 0.6 in terms of effect sizes. So given the difference in size of the effect across the studies that looked for it and in our study, I don't think that bilingual priming effect is due to priming of the negate and combine structure. So what else could it be? What we suggested, one of the possibilities we suggested in Bott and Chandler and in recent Bott, was that the priming effect was caused by making the alternative salient. So we're talking kind of the monolingual studies here. So the idea is that strong prime is making the alternative more salient. So then you're more likely to derive the implicature in the target trial. Or alternative, that weak prime suppresses the alternative to make it less salient when it comes to the target. And so what you get is, something like this, that the subject reads the prime, some of the symbols are hearts, looks at the cards, kind of derives the implicature. Okay, not all of the symbols are hearts. And, suddenly all the alternative is much more salient in their mind. And so when they come to the target, some of the symbols are suns, it's much easier for them to derive the implicature because the alternative is more readily available. And that works fine for a monolingual experiment. But here, what we have is cross-language priming. Now, that means the priming, that the alternatives that is being primed, it can't be formulated. It can't be lexical. It has to be a conceptual or a logical form representation of the alternative. So that's what has to be made salient if we're going to go along with this priming alternatives explanation. So you get something like this. You get, the Welsh clicai ywai siapiau, and that primes the logical form or the conceptual representation of all. And then that is what primes the implicature in the target. Now, if that's the case, we have a situation where we have evidence for the alternative not being formulated. And that has, I think, various implications for theories of implicatures. So, first of all, it at least partially explains how implicatures can be so fast. So, I perfectly accept Jesse's explanation in this kind of direct mapping idea, but I'm not talking about kind of no speed here. I'm talking about how it can be done even in 200 or 300 milliseconds. Because if you say that your alternatives have to be formulated, then you have to recruit an awful lot of apparatus to find the lexical expression, to find the syntax, to generate that sentence. And if you don't have to formulate the sentence, then you can formulate the alternative, then you can do things much more quickly. But that comes with some costs in that our accounts of how alternatives are constrained, how we choose the right alternative, are often they're often lexically based. So the most common one, of course, is that they're the entailment scale, in that some and all are basically lexically stipulated. But of course, if you don't invoke the lexicon to derive your alternatives, then you can't use lexical stipulation to constrain the range of alternatives. Likewise with sentence complexity. So Fox and Katse's a beautiful, wonderful account of how you constrain alternatives. Doesn't work if you don't formulate those sentences. So those are the implications of saying that the alternative is not formulated. But apart from the fact that we tend to assume that they are when we're writing things down, I can't see any reason why we think that they are formulated. It makes perfect sense that you don't formulate these alternatives in normal conversation. Just want to wrap up then and come to some conclusions. I mean, I think priming is a useful paradigm. It can be used with children, whether you agree with the study I showed you or not. I think it's perfectly possible to look at priming in children. It's a very implicit technique. Your participants don't really know what's going on, which is very useful. It's not metalinguistic in the ways that many other tasks are. You get within subject effects as well. So we were talking about kind of revising the children revising their beliefs. And what we have in this situation, at least, is children changing their mind as you go through the experiment, because they're within subject priming effects. So it's perhaps not quite the same as revising, but certainly changing is going on here. And of course, you can get big effects, which are much easier to investigate than small ones. That said, I think there's still a lot to do on priming. I think one of the reasons that it's useful is that it allows us to integrate experimental pragmatics with decades of work in wider psycholinguistics and compare the sorts of representations that we are assuming in pragmatics with those that have evolved in other areas of psycholinguistics. It also allows us to look at how the lexicon interacts with our pragmatic processes in a way that we haven't done very much of so far. But there is a processing, I don't know what you call it, a problem here, but there is a tendency to rely on response choices when doing these tasks. And first of all, you kind of ignore one big element of humans is how we actually do these things rather than just the outcome. But also, as we know, you can't entirely dissociate response choices from response time, because if you give people more time to respond, then they come up with different response choices. So I think there needs to be work on combining the processing elements with the response choices of the priming paradigm. So I'd just like to thank everybody, my collaborators, Emmanuel Chemler, Alice Rees, Suzanne Muntz, Chiara Gambi, Valentino and Filippo for organising, and of course Ira for setting me on this wonderful path. Thank you.